The idea that some drugs could help people who have problems with other drugs requires a little imagination. Fortunately, our next panel is far from imaginary. Bryan Hubbard, Executive Director of the Reed Foundation's American Ibogaine Initiative and a one-man tsunami of advocacy work. Nadelmann, Advocate for Global Drug Policy Reform and founder and former Executive Director at Drug Policy Alliance. Kasia Malinowska, Director of the Global Drug Policy Program at Open Society Foundations. Juliana Mulligan, Psychotherapist and Ibogaine Harm Reduction Specialist. And Robert Rooks, who is the CEO of the One for Justice Criminal Justice Reform Advocacy Coalition. Moderating today is Simeon Schnapper, psychedelic investor and general partner at JLS Fund. Next up, Iboga and the Opioid Crisis, a radical path to healing.
All right, so I am your moderator. My name is Simeon. I am humbled and very excited to kick this off. We need easily 45 hours, and we only have 44 minutes and 17 seconds. So what I'm going to do first is allow each person to introduce themselves if there's anything else beyond what Dom so poetically introduced. Just go through that, and then we'll just jump into it. I don't have prepared questions. It's going to be very free flow. And some people did ask, wow, that's a very dense panel. You have Ethan, who founded DPA, Juliana with IDREAMA, Robert from One for Justice, my favorite criminal justice philanthropy, obviously Kasia, and the latest Joe Rogan celebrity sitting to my right, Bryan Hubbard, who I met in Kentucky 2 or so years ago as he kicked off that initiative. So just in rapid order, maybe starting with Bryan to my right, just introduce yourself. Try not to go more than 30 seconds because we're going to get into the weeds. And I'd like to potentially open it up for questions as well at the end. So this is going to be rapid fire for the next 30 minutes. And we'll see where the conversation goes. And without further ado, Bryan.
My name is Bryan Hubbard. It is a privilege to be here with y'all this afternoon. I'd like to thank the Eden Foundation for the invitation. And I would also like to express solidarity with my fellow Icelanders here because English is also my second language.
Nice.
Hi, everyone. Still Kasia Malinowska. Open Society Foundations have been my professional home for now close to 26 years. And so I've had the privilege to look at drug-related issues through that prism, really across the globe. So really, really happy to explore what's new in store for us in that field.
Good afternoon. My name is Robert Rooks. I am the CEO of One for Justice, a donor collaborative where we raise money for criminal justice reform in the United States. I have been an advocate to change laws to reduce incarceration in the U.S. for about 26 years. We've had significant progress, but we're in trouble, and that's why I'm here.
I am Ethan Nadelmann, been involved in drug policy reform for almost 40 years as an academic and activist, founder of Lindesmith Center, then the Drug Policy Alliance, and really working on 3 major areas. One was ending cannabis prohibition through in the U.S. and more broadly. The second was ending the role of the drug war in mass incarceration in the U.S., and the last third was treating drug use and addiction as a health issue, not a criminal issue. So essentially harm reduction, and working primarily in the US, but also engaged very much internationally. Psychedelics for me has been mostly something I was not involved in the policy side, it was much more the personal side.
Hi everybody, I'm Juliana Mulligan. I introduced myself last panel, but I am a former opioid user, formerly incarcerated, licensed psychotherapist and Ibogaine treatment specialist. I work with people before and after Ibogaine treatment, but I also advise and consult for Ibogaine research projects and new clinics, and I have a new project that's a training program for Ibogaine treatment training and certification program. Something else that I've been working really hard on is advocating for people who are harmed in the Ibogaine space and working to create better systems of accountability and regulation in our space as well. So excited to be here.
Fantastic. So my experience with Ibogaine and Iboga, I was very fortunate. I moved to West Africa when I was 17 on my own, and I was introduced to it on the dance floor. So this panel is, we'll see where it goes, but I'm going to ask Bryan to speak next, specifically about the opioid epidemic and some of the initiatives, including the American Ibogaine Initiative, potentially some of his work that predated that, starting in Kentucky, the involvement of other states and internationally. But I do want to start this, because it's free-flowing, that there's many applications for Ibogaine, or I should say Iboga. Mine was basically, I was offered, this was again, wow, I'm getting old. 2017. Well, okay, it was a long time ago. And I was at a dance club in Togo on the Ghanaian border. And it was my weekend thing. You know, I had this ability to do whatever I wanted. I was 17, living alone. So I would party over the weekend. And there was this one weekend where, you know, the guy came to me and he had something white and very stepped on in his right hand, and something bitter and brown bark in his left hand. So my initial experience being introduced to the sacred wood was in the non-traditional context. And I think that's important because we're talking about harm reduction, we're talking about how this gets out there. I've met with dozens of underground people, both here and abroad, where sometimes these drugs get into society, not necessarily just in the way that's medicalized, which I want to talk about. And for those of you who remember Right Said Fred, I'm Too Sexy for My Body, that was when I had my first experience, and it was on the dance floor. And it was exquisite. The sun came up, I met these new friends, we spent the day together, we went back to the club. So I wouldn't call it an initiation, where I'm also an initiate in a bungee and have done flood doses and support wherever I can. But I've been fascinated by this molecule all the time. And it's so nuanced. We're going to talk about Ibogaine and Iboga and the opioid crisis, but it is so nuanced. And this, to me, feels very much the year of Iboga and Ibogaine in 2025. So maybe with that, Bryan, I would love to hear just a little bit about your journey, maybe starting in Kentucky and where you're at right now, and as it relates to the opioid epidemic, too.
I grew up in the U.S. state of Virginia, which has 5 coal mining counties, and what I would describe as an economy that is very much based on the extraction of natural resources, which requires a significant toll and extraction on human resources. From where I was raised, I went and moved into Kentucky, where I obtained a law degree, and I had an accidental legal career doing workers' compensation litigation, representing 3 of the state's largest employers for 16 years statewide, through what I can only describe as a happenstance connection that raptured me out of private legal practice and into state service. I came to run what's called Social Security Disability in the United States, which is a federal program that is designed to provide health care and income benefits to individuals who do not have the ability to perform any kind of work. I ran that system for about 2.5 years, and then came to run the state's Office of Medicaid Fraud and Abuse Control, Medicaid being a health care benefit that is provided to low-income individuals nationwide. And from that job, I came to run Kentucky's Opioid Commission, which was set up by the legislature there to oversee and administer over $1 billion in settlement funds, which had been negotiated from opioid distributors and manufacturers for their role in the creation and perpetuation of the opioid epidemic. I lay that foundation to say that I have watched the opioid epidemic play out since the detonation of OxyContin by Purdue Pharma in the mountains of central and southern Appalachia in 1996. I've seen it in my hometown, I've seen it in my family, I have seen it in my state and across the United States. First of all, let's acknowledge that the opioid epidemic is the gravest engineered humanitarian catastrophe to play out within the United States specifically and Western society generally since the end of the 19th century. This was a premeditated and orchestrated assault upon individuals who find themselves trapped in lives of desperation, pain, and poverty, with those three conditions being the roadmap that was followed first and foremost by Purdue Pharma with the deployment of OxyContin beginning in 1996. When I came to run the Opioid Commission, I said we have to prioritize the discovery of a breakthrough therapeutic for treatment of opioid dependency, recognizing that the very best therapeutic options we have are delivering unacceptably mediocre results. Abstinence-based programs have about a 7% rate of success, and what I have come to call opioid maintenance treatment, whereby we are delivering opioids to treat opioids, have at best a 25% success rate. In July of 2022, I heard the word Ibogaine for the very first time and came to be very well educated by a lot of individuals, some of whom are sitting on this stage, about the reality that it has the capacity to resolve physiological opioid dependence when properly administered in the correct set and setting. With that knowledge, I proceeded to conduct what I considered to be a very intensive 6-month second full-time job of critical examination and due diligence, which led me to the conviction that this was an opportunity that I was willing to lay my reputation and everything that I had built by way of personhood down for in terms of advancing an opportunity within the state of Kentucky to bring Ibogaine to the people there for the purposes of liberating them from an addiction that our very best systems maintain. That's what has brought me to this stage today, and I am pleased to report that as we sit here on February the 27th, what appeared to be an absolute dead-in-the-water project with the termination of the Kentucky Ibogaine Initiative on December 15th of 2023 has now found life and expression in the following ways. First of all, as of today, there are 4 states in the United States that have seen filed active and pending legislation to advance funding for Ibogaine research and development. And those states are Washington, Arizona, New York, and of all places, Kentucky. And by or before March 6th, I am greatly optimistic that the great state, the Lone Star State of Texas, will be the 5th and most consequential to lead the band to see the breakthrough for Ibogaine for U.S. society sooner rather than later.
Bravo. Robert, I'd like to ask you a question, skipping over. So, first, if you could be more impassioned next time, Bryan, that would be appreciated. So I had the great pleasure of recently being in the country of Angola, but earlier this last year I attended the inaugural One for Justice conference in New Orleans, and a group of us went to Angola Prison, the largest prison in the United States. And what I witnessed there was it pulled on my heartstrings in the same capacity of witnessing someone go through an Ibogaine treatment. You know, where they show up and it's just like, oh my God, death's door. Whether it's crack, whether it's cocaine, whether it's, one guy I remember, you know, his veins were so blown out he was shooting fentanyl in his neck, and he had just escaped a cartel kidnapping where he watched his friend being decapitated. Literally on death's door, and by day 10, he was reborn. It was quite fantastic. But the second most impactful thing that I felt in my bones was this trip to Angola, where after a visit on death row, which was the cherry on top, which seems weird that I'm equating the cherry on top for this incredibly hard, gritty, dark experience, was the warden who set up a makeshift detox. And what he said was like, listen, I know drugs are going to get in here. I'm not going to ignore that. And he set up a detox. There were 160 guys I got to spend with others 2 full hours with. Their protocol was over 6 weeks, and it involved faith and abstinence. So you had 160 guys doing nothing but praying. There were Muslims. There was actually one Jew, which I thought was interesting in Louisiana with the Bible, but it was mostly of Christian faith and ideology. And that was it. Cold turkey for 6 weeks, but he designed it. So it was just so impactful. And then talking to so many of them, they were in Angola because of a drug conviction, because they got addicted to fentanyl or heroin and then oxy and then fentanyl. But Robert, if you could just share a little about how, and reflecting on Will's amazing opening introduction, where it's just a weave. How is criminal justice reform woven into everything we're talking about with the opioid epidemic and alternative therapies, or specifically for this panel, Ibogaine?
No, absolutely, and thank you for that, bringing up Angola and what you saw there. Imagine a world where instead of the war on drugs, we actually focused on reducing harm. Imagine, and instead of a system that focused on punishment, we had systems that focused on healing. Imagine if true public safety didn't matter your zip code, your race, your ethnicity. That's the world many of us, Ethan and others, have been working so hard to try and achieve. And frankly, over the last 15 years, we've seen significant progress. We reduced the prison population in California by 50%, New York by 50%, closed prisons in Texas, Michigan. We've done so much to try to right-size and transform the U.S. criminal justice system. But then something happened. That's COVID. And COVID locked us in. Right? It forced us to have to stay indoors and disconnected us from our systems of support, our systems of help. And not everyone handled that well. And so in the US post-COVID, we started to see increased issues of public disorder, right? People were not comfortable riding the subways anymore because of fear of being yelled at or screamed at because of mental health disorder. We saw addiction and overdose, right, get to high levels because people were coming out and wasn't prepared for what we had just experienced. And so what happened was the public, instead of looking at the failures of a system that was built for 30 years, they looked at us, the criminal justice reform movement, and said, hey, what's going on? You guys, right, were supposed to deliver right, safety and equality and justice, and now we see things are worse. And as I said in my opening, we are in trouble. Right? The truth of the matter is we need to figure out what are real solutions to safety, how we're going to address issues of public disorder, addiction, and mental illness. And I'm here because I believe Ibogaine has a significant role. Now, I don't want to overplay it. There needs to be processes. We need to figure out how to roll out in ways that are healthy and safe, and make sure those that administer it are well-trained. But I tell you what, we are in a crisis in the U.S. right now. To your point about the prison, overdose deaths are the third largest number of deaths in U.S. prisons. When people are released from prison and go back into their community, it's the first largest number of deaths is overdose deaths. When you look at what people are dying of, 89% of fentanyl. Like, we are in a crisis. You won't read it in the New York Times. You won't read it or see it on CNN. But we are in a situation, and I believe that together we can build real strategies for help real strategies for sustainability. And we have a track record of winning. And I end with this. I know a lot of people are concerned about this current administration, right? And things are falling apart all around us. But for this issue, right now is the time. Right now is the time to go full steam ahead, because I think we can get what needs to be done to position this issue for real change in our community.
Actually, Ethan. Whoa. Ethan, my question to you is, do you own a suit? No, I'm kidding.
Okay, I'll run with that one if you like.
No, in all fairness, I've been a fan of Ethan since I first learned about the DPA, which was a long time ago, potentially around that first Dancing to Right Said Fred in Togo. That being said, God, yeah, I'm reflecting on everything the DPA has done. So my question is simply one that is not a question. I would just like you to reflect and comment on everything you've done and how this is all nuanced and interwoven to the title of this panel.
I like the suit question
Okay,
better.
or do you have a suit?
Yeah, I'll do my best on that. You know, first of all, with respect to Ibogaine, I mean, I've been familiar with Ibogaine really since the late 80s, early 90s. Howard Lotsoff, you know, was really the godfather of it and his work, and Ken Alper, the researcher, I remember giving him a grant back 25 years ago to do a conference at NYU on it. So its potential has been there. And the fact that because of the work of Bryan and others, as well as the research, it's really taken off is incredibly exciting. Now, I also want to, in answering what you're asking, Simeon, just reflect on some of the comments before, you know, in the earlier panel, and I think it was, there was, I think maybe Allison, Kasia, talking about this notion of psychedelic exceptionalism. Mm-hmm. And we're all familiar with the notion of psychedelic exceptionalism. These drugs are special. And we're also familiar with the phenomenon in many cases of trying to condemning people for being psychedelic exceptionists. And so I just want to be right out there at the start and saying, I am a psychedelic exceptionalist. I am a psychedelic and cannabis exceptionalist. And I say that because those two broad categories of substances in my own life have had an incredible net positive, whereas the other ones, not so much. And I think for the broader society, the psychedelics and cannabis, a huge net positive for the, not all positive, there's negatives, but a huge net positive, whereas the other ones, not so much. And we know with fentanyl, other substances, methamphetamine, it can be really problematic. But having said that I am a psychedelic exceptionist when it comes to my own personal use into the policy issues, it does not mean that I am a psychedelic exceptionalist when it comes to the underlying principles, right? Because the way I see it, the underlying core principle in this world here, in the broader world of harm reduction, in the broader world of drug policy reform, the underlying core principle is that nobody but nobody deserves to be punished simply for what we put into our bodies, absent harm to others, right? Nobody but nobody deserves to be punished or discriminated against or amongst based simply upon what we put into our bodies if we don't hurt other people. That has to be the core principle. Now, that doesn't mean that, and what that means in actual practical terms is that nobody, that no drug should be illegal to simply possess for your own use, whether it's Ibogaine, cannabis, alcohol, tobacco, fentanyl, what have you. It does mean that one might have very different regulatory policies in terms of how we control access to these things, in terms of what we do with these things. But that core principle, I think, has to be paramount, right? So that even as we acknowledge it. Now, some of the other implications of this, and one of the things, Simeon, I was very proud about at Drug Policy Alliance, is it was bringing together and trying to build a movement in a way. It was looking out, and there was, you know, the young kid with cannabis, you know, leaves in his, you know, blonde dreadlocks saying hemp will save the universe. and there was the person doing needle exchange programs in Vietnam, and there was the person fighting the stigma against people on methadone, and there was the person doing psychedelic stuff, and there was the person doing prison reform and trying to reduce mass incarceration. There was the libertarian who just said, get the government out of this whole business. It was doing that whole entire weave of people understanding that we were united in part by what we were all against the war on drugs, against the punitive prohibitionist policies, against the ideology of abstinence only as a way of dealing with drugs, both responsible drug use and also problematic drug use. But it also meant that when I would go to a cannabis conference, or it might be a psychedelics conference, and I would hear people say, hey, this is the answer for pain, for this, da-da-da, and I'd say, wait a second, opioids have been the historical way of dealing with pain for thousands of years. Opioids are not going to stop playing a role. There are types of pain that psychedelics or that cannabis will never be able to deal with, where opioids is going to be essential. So do not throw it all out. One of the things I've done since retiring from Drug Policy Alliance is join the board of an organization called NPAC, National Pain Advocate Center, I think it is, headed by Kate Nicholson, which is fighting against the now pendulum swinging so far against opioids that basically people are being stripped off their opioids even though they were being successfully maintained on those things, and oftentimes going to the black market or going to suicide or what have you. And then I go to the pain medicine conferences where they're focused on opioids and say, how many are you familiar with the role of cannabis in helping to deal with pain? And most of them would not be, and I would tongue lash them for being ignorant. So it's about all of this, is understanding that we're dealing with the opioid epidemic right now, right, with 100,000 deaths, more than all the auto deaths and all the gun deaths in America put together in recent years, right? That Ibogaine is going to play a pivotal role, so are some of the other psychedelics, so is the expansion, easier access to methadone and buprenorphine, so are other non-drug means, so is more non-punitive 12-step-y type approaches. They're all going to be able to play a role, and people are going to move from one to the other, right? It means that if we're dealing with the even greater addiction crisis, right, not opioids, but in my country, almost 500,000 people are going to die prematurely of their cigarette addiction, and worldwide 7 to 8 million people. It means in that field, I know that tobacco harm reduction makes as much sense with tobacco as it does with opiates. It means that e-cigarettes and vaping and pouches have to be part of what we're doing there, and that the cry, we have to protect the kids, the whole damn war on drugs has been justified as one great big Child Protection Act. At the same time, I'm looking at the potential for psilocybin and maybe Ibogaine and others to help deal with the problem of tobacco addiction, which is killing 7 to 8 million people around the world. So it's understanding that even as we focus and specialize and just get delighted by the potential of Ibogaine, Iboga, and the other substances, this is a broader movement. This is a complex area dealing with substances. We have to be tolerant of all the other ones as well.
Bravo.
Okay, note to self, and also Simon, don't ever make me speak after him.
Well, let me interject, because I think you will trump him, maybe not with the impassioned, always, I could listen to this guy talk for 100 hours. But one of the things I would love for you to share, because we're talking about macro, and I'm going to, after you're done, Juliana, to wrap it up real world, because we do want to allot some time for questions. But everything you've done over the decades at the macro level, policies, accords, treaties, conventions, can you just share how that happens? Like the stories you've shared about going to Vienna to move the needle. I barely knew this stuff, and I've claimed to have been in this industry for, since I danced on the dance floor technically. But how does that whole world work, and how does it relate to this stuff Bryan is saying, the States, other countries, et cetera?
Okay, so note to self, I will end on that. Okay. And let me start by agreeing with Ethan, but also offering the following thought. There needs to be nuance, and there needs to be embracement of all the options that are required for the complexity of the situation. And also, there needs to be respect and lifting up each other's interventions in a way that is constructive. And here's what I mean. A couple of weeks ago, actually in a restaurant that you and I sat in, someone else I was having lunch with, person was talking to me about Ibogaine, and basically he started by saying, Because, you know, we now have thousands of people who are addicted by pharmaceuticals to Suboxone and who are going to be on it forever, and we need to wean them all off, and we need them on Ibogaine. And I said, you know, if we think about drug treatment like any other medical treatment, then why does it bother you that someone is on Suboxone for 6 months, a year, 2 years? I'm on hypertension medication. No one is asking me, when are you going to get off? And you know, people could ask me that question, because if I exercised every day and ate maybe better and maybe had a slightly less stressful lifestyle, maybe I could control my blood pressure. But nowhere ever did my doctor say to me, when are you going to get off? Why are you dependent on pharmaceuticals? Why are we using that question when it comes to people who are on methadone or Suboxone? What business is it of ours? People need that medicine at this current moment to do well. Let them be on it. What is that urgency to get everyone off? So I think that if we indeed think that drug treatment is like any other treatment, medical treatment, then let's think about what our common friend Bob Newman used to say, right? If it's treatment, then use medical treatment assumptions, agreements, also when it comes to addiction treatment. And so this question, whether someone is on it 3 months, 6 months, a year, 2 years, okay, you know, just like on any other medication. And so I give this as an example that, you know, when advocating for Ibogaine, we don't have to put down other treatment options. We can equally respect people who are in abstinence if it works for them, people who are on, you know, in AA if that works for them, right? And we can expand our toolbox by including Ibogaine as a powerful medicine. And so really, if there's one thing that I really hope all of us get to do together, is to respect and lift up what is evidence-based, what has worked for people, and that by sort of introducing our options, our ideas, our excitement into the mix, we don't do it by putting down and stepping down on others. And I think that will be important in the current moment. I know that a lot of people are excited about our new health czar. Okay, God help us all. Listen carefully to what is being said. The same person that is opening up some options for psychedelics is also talking about treatment forms because it worked for him 42 years ago. How is that evidence-based? So again, let's be consistent in our enthusiasm and also in holding people accountable, because we do not want to be throwing a baby with bathwater just because, you know, psychedelics are on the rise. Now, when it comes to the international, you know, again, something that Americans have a hard time grasping, which is we are part of a much larger ecosystem, and that much larger ecosystem is managed, in fact, or inspired or architectured by drug conventions. And it's, you know, I look at it with some amazement, where my enthusiastic colleagues in the US think that they can change the world without changing the international regime. That ain't gonna happen. I'm really sorry to tell you that ain't gonna happen. And that is one more reason why we all need to be talking to each other. Right now, coca leaf is under consideration to be descheduled. It was a racist move in the international system where dirty Indians, I'm really sorry for the use of that term, coca users were colonized, discriminated against, and basically just that's how coca scheduling got justified. So half a century later, we want to right the historical wrong, and we want to deschedule coca. That will be a really important lesson learned for us, for Ibogaine, right? That will be very important for all of our thinking around ayahuasca. So again, there's this tiny little group working on coca leaf, while all of us should be working on coca leaf, because what happens with coca leaf will have implications for all the other plant medicines. And so the reality is that we really need to wrap our heads around this together. Another example that I have given folks a couple of years ago, China came to Vienna and wanted to schedule ketamine. That would have been a horrible thing. I mean, Schedule 1. That would have been a horrible thing because this is the only analgesic in most of the developing world, right? We would have cut off people in the developing world from the only analgesic. And it was not the psychedelic community that stepped up to prevent that from happening. It was the harm reduction community, it was the drug policy community, it was the pain community. All of you guys were absent. Okay, that was now, I think, 7 years ago. That cannot continue this way, okay? We need you in Vienna. We need you to show up. We need you to show up for coca descheduling. We need you to show up for other discussions of the international regime, because the moment where privileged North does whatever it wants to, has limits. And we are going to bump against those limits. So show up for the international community, not only because it's good for all of us, but in long term, it'll be good for you.
Wow. Fantastic. Juliana, as we're under 10 minutes, I'm going to give you the final words, and in theory, we'll have time for a question. The first thing I'd like to share is, the hypertension protocol you're working on with Ibogaine. No, I'm kidding. There's no hypertension protocol. But there probably will be by the end of the conference to make your points. But my experience, I met Juliana, I'm not sure when, but always appreciated her depth in this particular community, both as working at clinics, consulting, advising. And I'd just like you to share, because it's come up in conversations in between, how you see the medicalized version and how that plays into things that one would say are how it was happening over thousands of years, whether it was Bwiti or Bunji or Pygmies, and potentially comment, I think Allison was on the third panel this morning. Allison's an attorney who helped establish the first Iboga church in the United States, which... I already said it. Now he's going to have a waiting list of 100,000. But it was an hour and 20 minutes from Grand Central to this place where you could actually eat the bark. But if you could just comment also on just the depth of your experience and what you've seen in the clinics, how it's evolving, but certainly medicalized, which is very much going to be an approach we must, to some extent, follow if we want insurance and FDA, versus traditional, which you're also deep in.
So the big difference with Ibogaine from all the other psychedelics is that you can die. Anyone can die if Ibogaine's done improperly because of the cardiotoxic side effects. This is no joke. It doesn't matter if you've been trained in Gabon, in the indigenous practices, this can still happen to anybody. And so even though I am in support of decriminalization of all substances, Ibogaine really needs to have an accompanying protocol that is mandated, that is enforced, where there's accountability, where there's supervision. There needs to be a centralized training process, and we have had none of that in the Ibogaine world. There are clinics running and individual practitioners working all over the world. Outside of jurisdictions, even in Mexico where the clinics are, Ibogaine's not officially approved there either. So clinics kind of just do whatever they want. And despite us having a published clinical protocol from 2016, many facilities don't follow this. Many facilities pretend they're following it and cut corners. And right now in the world, in terms of Ibogaine for opioid detox, I have 3 places that I would feel safe sending anybody to right now, which is a small percentage of the total amount of treatment that's happening worldwide. This is a really bad ratio, and it needs to be improved. And something that I've long been dreaming of is having a centralized training and certification process, not just so that we can have the same training, everyone gets the same training, but to also have accompanying mandatory supervision so that people can get support and be held accountable when things go wrong. Giving Ibogaine treatments is the hardest job I've ever done. You are on duty at all hours. People can die if you make the smallest misstep or you stop watching the cardiac monitor. It's extremely stressful. We have a really high burnout rate in the community because of this, because you have to be on duty all the time, because people are facing their darkest parts of themselves while in your care, and they want to blame it on you sometimes. So we have a really big problem with practitioners not taking care of themselves. Often, many of us come directly from our own substance use patterns to working in Ibogaine, sometimes in a matter of months, which is quite dangerous. And there's a lot of practitioners who have never gone to therapy for themselves, definitely aren't in supervision, and end up doing some really dangerous things in treatment. On average, one Ibogaine provider either dies or ends up on the street per year because they didn't take the time to do the work on themselves before starting to provide this treatment. And they start doing things in treatment, they start using substances or doing some other kind of behaviors that compromises the clients and themselves. So we need to do something about this. As Ibogaine gets brought to the world, we still haven't established a centralized process to be able to manage this somewhat dangerous treatment, and I'm a bit concerned. It's very exciting that people are learning about Ibogaine and it's getting all this attention right now, but I would have loved for us to have a more centralized training and supervision process first. And so that's why I'm urgently working on getting my program, Edrima, started, so that we can have the support for providers that is much needed. I would love to see everybody who's providing Ibogaine be in therapy that's funded. I would love for everyone to be under supervision and have peer support groups, because it's not just about punishing or holding people accountable for missteps. I also want people who work in Ibogaine to feel nourished, to feel stable and supported enough to be able to conduct this really complicated treatment. And so that's what I'm hoping to build as Ibogaine expands. There's this big question about Bwiti, which is the indigenous religion that Iboga comes from in Gabon and southern Cameroon, and how do we protect and respect their tradition while also doing this very clinical, medicalized version in the West. And this is something, there's a new clinic opening in Mexico called Base Root that is trying to really bridge this gap of reciprocity and conservation and a medical model. And what they're doing is they're in direct cooperation with a not-for-profit in Gabon that is women-led, and they're going to be giving a percentage of their profits to various efforts that they're doing over there. And I think that this is really what should happen, is that anybody working in Ibogaine should be giving back to the communities that steward this medicine originally, and that often isn't happening. So that is another piece. And there's also another element to Ibogaine treatment, and that is that all of the mostly Western people that have been trained somewhat in Bwiti, opening retreats to provide an indigenous context for this use. And this is, there's one side of it where this is very beautiful. They're trying to help people connect with the indigenous tradition of the medicine, and also it's rife with cultural appropriation. And I often see people going to Gabon for a few months and suddenly becoming an Nganga, which is a shaman in Bwiti, which is not how it works. It takes years of training to be able to do so. And so it's very complicated to be bringing this medicine into the West to try to maintain the indigenous practices in an ethical way. And I think that we don't have it quite figured out yet, but I do think that giving back to communities in Gabon is an essential part of this process if we are really going to work ethically and safely. So,
fantastic. Thank you, Juliana. Well, we are at the 2-minute mark, so I don't think we have time for questions. But for those of you who perked up at Juliana's last statements and the ecosystem of supply and how it's being administered, I invite you to come to the 10:30 panel on Iboga, where you will see a GMP qualified manufacturer of Ibogaine. You'll see a Gabonese representation. You'll see the largest Iboga farm in West Africa, and others. I can't thank you guys enough for joining and adding nuance to it, from Juliana's real-world experience to Ethan's decades of not only being a psychedelic exceptionalist, but also being able to say, be fair, to Robert and everything he's doing as it relates to criminal justice reform, of course, to Kasia, who's done more. God, that fentanyl story is one that resonates so much. Ketamine. I didn't know that's what went down. And when I learned that it wasn't this community, when we call plant medicine community, but it was the harm reduction community that saved the lives of countless sub-Saharan citizens, where that's the only drug. You know, you're having a difficult childbirth, you're hit by a car, and yes, it works for that. It didn't come from there, so that was really nuanced. And then in the last 30 seconds, my favorite gentleman from Kentucky, I want to thank Bryan for all of his efforts from the first time we spoke, which was years ago, to watching him just move forward and put his reputation on the line and come out publicly, most notably with the, I think it got some of the most hits of this Joe Rogan podcast, right? It was quite phenomenal. And what he's doing in the 5 states, leading with Texas and the rest of the world. So in the last 14 seconds, thank you all. We'll give the stage to the next panel, which is very exciting, on the media. The story moves everything we're having a discussion about right now. So thank you all, and thank you for joining, and see you later.